I'm going to do this all inside of VS Code. All I did is I knew that a new terminal application in C#. So all this means that this is going to run inside of our terminal. There's no fancy browser, no fancy UI. On the left side of my screen, that is your first real glance at C#. As you see, just to get a program up and running, there's a lot of extra, we like to call ceremony or noise to go around. There's a lot of stuff going on there, but really as developers, typically we can ignore a lot of it. And a lot of what's gonna happen is gonna happen down here inside of our main here. As you see, I have some comments of stuff that I wanna show you. In C# comments look a lot like JavaScript comments, good old //. And on the right here, I have my terminal. So this terminal is where I'm actually going to be running my code. So here I'm going to use the .NET tools, and I'm going to watch run. And what this allows me to do is that this will actually watch all my files. And because C# is a compiled language, it's going to say, hey, whenever you change your programs, I'm going to recompile the entire code for you. So there will be a little bit of a delay, but I gain a lot from making that delay happen. As we'll see, as we'll probably mess up once or twice.
Yeah.
Typing.
So for instance, like make the same mistake I did, not have a main. Like what if you change main, misspell the word main there?
Yeah. So if I make a mistake, it's going to recompile it started, and it's going to give me an error. And it's actually pretty explicit. Hey, program does not contain something called main. I need to have a main somewhere.
Yeah. So if he's typed main like MANE, like
Yes.
I misspell initialize all the time, C#'s going to find it. Because it has expected things that it needs to see the way it needs to see it. Oh, yeah, main, like the state,
Yep.
right? Same thing. Hey, you spelled it correctly, and now your program ran.
Yep. So nothing's going to print out because I'm not doing anything. But now let's make some variables. So in JavaScript, we would do something like this, right? Let name equals Mark, right? Well, in C#, we care about what type that is. So every variable comes with a type, and that type is more in your face. So if I wanted to make a string, I would say, hey, string name equals Mark. We need to make that bigger.
Yeah.
Can you see that in the back now?
Yep.
Awesome. Ooh.
Yeah.
Flashing.
Wait, what's supposed to be on the right?
That's his program running.
That's my terminal.
Yeah, but his program isn't doing anything yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's not printing anything, so there's no output.
Yeah.
But you already noticed that it's already giving him warnings, and his editor is giving him warnings that he's made this variable called name, but he's not using it anywhere. That's because the compiler, as opposed to the interpreter, can look at the entire program at once, because it's kind of fed into the compilation process, and start to give him warnings of things that don't look right.
Yeah.
Right? So it's more introspective than it is Ruby.
Right, so it's much more like, hey, are you sure you want to do this? Are you sure you're doing this right? I don't trust you, so I'm going to say you're probably doing it wrong, kind of thing. If I wanted to print that out, our console is console.writeLine. So very similar to our Jet question.
Yeah, it was more of the, I guess, syntax and how you set up the language. Are we going to have to go back into Prettier and change around allowing semicolons, or does it understand since it's C, likes, and needs?
Yep.
Okay.
The prettier settings that we did the first week, like remove semicolons, change double quotes to single quotes, stuff like that, all those only affect JavaScript files.
Yeah.
You notice this is a program.cs file.
Yeah.
It's a C# file.
Yeah. And also notice that here Mark has to put semicolons in at the end of every line, and if he leaves them out, likely it will start to warn him.
I'll get a little red squiggle there saying, hey, semicolon expected, because it expected a semicolon. Semicolons dictate the end of a line or the end of an expression. Whenever we get into more complex lines and like multiple maps and selects, we can have multiple lines of code, but they all end with a semicolon.
Yeah. You'll notice that C# also likes capital case, right? Capital W, right? Capital L, line.
Yep.
Right. You're going to see a lot of that in C# as a stylistic difference.
Yes. Yes.
Nothing better or wrong or worse. Just that's the pattern that community goes for.
Yeah. So even though types are pretty in our face, and what I say by that, if I wanted to do like name equals 42 and change name from a string to an integer,
Nope.
I'm going to get an error.
And you're even gonna get squigglies in your editor.
Yep. Because I've defined name to be a string, now I can't change that. This is where the compiler is working with you a little bit.
Yeah.
It's
So,
saying, hey, wait a minute, you have something, you've told me it's a string, now you're trying to change it to something else.
Yeah.
You can't do that.
and if you try to send that variable to a method or a function
Yep.
that's expecting a string, but you pass in a number, the compiler's gonna warn you. Where Ruby's like, hey, whatever you want, man.
Yep.
You're cool. You know what you're doing, right? Have freedom.
Yeah.
Because Ruby, as opposed to having this strong typing, Ruby has what we call duck typing. D-U-C-K. If it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it must be a duck.
Yeah.
So if a variable can behave, a type can behave like another type, then it's cool. Because Ruby does not care about the type of thing that it is.
Yep.
Right? So strings have length and arrays have length. So you can pass a string or an array to a function that only needs it to have a length. Where in C#, you have to tell it what kind of variable is coming in.
Yep.
And the great part is it warns you of all those kinds of mistakes that a language like JavaScript and Ruby don't.
So it prevents you from making any errors before you move.
Yeah.
Yeah, it prevents you from making certain types of errors. I wish it prevented all errors. That'd be cool. But it keeps you, what I say is it keeps you in your lane.
Yeah.
It keeps you in your lane. If you like getting on the highway and driving somewhere and you're just like, I stay in this lane until I need to get off, awesome. That's like C#. We're gonna keep you in this lane. If you wander out of that lane, you're gonna get warnings.
Well, it
Right.
has that little sound like. Meh.
Right. Yeah. Lane departure
Yeah.
warning.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. This is your lane departure warning in your editor. Right. And I think that's awesome because it eliminates an entire classification of bugs that you never have to think about.
Like,
Yeah,
if
C#.
I know that my code compiles, I at least know that it's correct to a certain point. It may not be right, it may not be bug-free, but I know that, like, hey, I'm not trying to call toString on something that doesn't have toString. I'm not
Yeah.
trying to add two objects together when I can add two numbers.
Yeah, I'm sure you've all, as you've been writing JavaScript and React, you change your code, it reloads, and then you have to like go through your program and finally click on that button until you get the error, right? That's because JavaScript is only interpreting what's happening as you're doing it, and it doesn't see that that error is coming. Those type of errors get figured out here at the time your program compiles, not when you're running them. Runtime errors that happen while your code is running versus compile time errors. And languages like JavaScript and Ruby, it's very hard for them to do compile time errors. They have to rely on runtime to find a lot of these.
So you did some strings, you did some numbers, right?
Yeah, we made a couple numbers.
Yes, we do int, meaning life equals 42.
Prevent the end.
So you notice
Oh,
it's getting pointed out.
we could put the n in the wrong spot.
Oh, yeah. So we have int integer, meaning of life equals 42. Summit. And very much so, the typing is really much in your face, which is awesome. But as a program, that's a bit annoying. C# has kind of iterated on this concept, and we have this idea of a dynamic static typing with something called var. I'm sure you've seen me type var by mistake in JavaScript a few times. This is why. This is really how you declare variables in C#. What this var is doing, this var is looking at your code and figuring out the type of variable it is based by what you assign it. So I didn't tell it that name was a string anymore. I just said, hey, I got a variable that's called name that has this value, and the type of that value is string, therefore name is string. I still get the same compile time checking, so I can't do anything like this, name equals 100. It'll say, well, can't do it, sorry. So var is really kind of awesome in that I get all the perks of statically typed, but none of the frustrations.
Yeah, you don't have to double, you don't have to say string name equals a string. Int something equals an int. It just figures it out for you, which is cool.
Yep.
So shouldn't meaning be capital?
So for variables, it's all camel case. For methods and classes, it's Pascal case. Pascal, the only difference is Pascal case, the first level is capitalized, and camel case, the first level is lowercase. That's the only difference. whenever we get to making classes and functions in like 5 minutes, you'll notice
Okay.
that. So string interpolation, we also have that. If I wanted to write out hello name, the only thing that I have to change is I add a $sign at the start of my string, and that's it. That $sign says, hey, I'm going to interpolate stuff inside of this string, and then I can use my squiggles to insert names. Should feel familiar at least. A list. So C# is very object-oriented based. Everything is an object. I believe in Ruby you did like names equals
Yes,
and a list.
and a list. Yep.
Well, in C# we actually have something that's called a list. So var names equals new list. And because we care about the types, this is another place where we're working with the compiler. We have to say, hey, we have a list, an array, that holds something, strings. And inside of that, this is where we're going to have var Gavin, Jason, and Tony. So it's a little bit more verbose, but a little bit more explicit. I actually kind of like that because it kind of brings out meaning, gives my code a little more semantic meaning other than just names equals and arrays. That's because in C#, like in Ruby, the idea of lists is a very complicated subject. It's a very deep subject, which we'll get into. IEnumerables and ILists and collections and iCollections and all that other stuff, all those other big words mean have value. So like this is pretty much the first stepping stone to all of that.
Yeah, so for instance, like try and put a number into that list. What would happen?
So because I gave it, it's a list of strings. If I wanted to add something to it that was a number,
Right. Nope.
I can't do it.
Right. It's checking the rules for you.
Yep. If I wanted to, I have to find a common type that both the strings and integers share. Which I could make this a list of just object. A generic object is just a list of things, and it'll work just fine. But now I've lost type check.
Yeah.
One thing that C# is kind of driving towards is trying to make dynamic type checking a thing. Is
Yeah.
trying to have the best of both worlds.
And what's interesting is Ruby is trying to drive towards static types.
Yeah.
The real answer is somewhere in the middle.
Yes. Yes.
And we're both approaching the same problem from different ends of the spectrum, but we're kind of both heading towards the middle.
Mhm. String again. Kento as well. We also have map, filter, and reduce. Var readings, but for us, it's no longer map. It's .select. Does the same thing, different verbiage. Hello,
It's
I.
usually the same because Ruby select was filter, right? Or
Yes. Yeah, but .NET's select is a map.
Map, right? Yeah.
And that always trips me up when I do any kind of .NET stuff.
Sure.
Because like my brain is trained, like select is the thing that
Right.
makes a list smaller. In .NET, select is transforming.
Yeah. So yeah, select is transforming it from a list of strings to a bigger list of strings. For filter, var short names, we have names.where. And these arrow functions are what's called actions or expressions or lambdas or delegates or functions, whatever you want to call them. But it's just like our arrow functions were in JavaScript. It's just a function that says, hey, do this or return a value for everything.
So where is filter?
Yep. Where's filter? Hello. Give me all the ones where name.length is less than or equal to 4. We also have reduce. Did you show them reduce?
No. Go back to the length thing again. Type that code in again, but really slowly. So I think there's an important thing that was missed here. Delete the rest of that line. Yeah, see how he gets the autocomplete? So if he types name dot, right, because C# is a statically typed language, it knows all of the methods that that variable has on it, and it's typed. Ruby has none of that. So you're not going to get any Ruby help in the editor. Sorry,
Yeah.
you just don't get it.
The
But
IntelliSense
IntelliSense is super good.
Super strong here. So it knows that in this sense, name is a string. It knows what libraries are included in the project. So by all that virtue, because of that, it knows everything that it could possibly type here. And it's like you can only type stuff that's here. If you're trying to type something that's not here,
It's probably not a thing. Yeah, so as soon as you typed L, capital L, right? And look, and even look over here, right? Like it tells, where's length? Yeah, right. So when you had length selected, I think it even gave you like the documentation for it.
yeah, if I
you
hover
hover
over
it?
it, it's like, hey, here's the documentation for,
Gets the number of characters.
down here, pardon the errors, here's the documentation for string.length. We're saying, hey, this thing returns an integer and this is what it's doing. So all of that is because it's a compile time language and it knows what's going on.
Yeah, it's compile time and it's strongly typed.
Yes.
And from that you get more stay in your lane kind of stuff with automatic type, auto completion, and documentation right in the editor.
Yep.
You don't get that. You don't get that a lot with languages like Ruby. You can with JavaScript because they work really hard. Like VS Code and others have worked really hard to get that kind of documentation in. There is some of that for Ruby, but it's not as good as C#'s
Yeah.
built-in auto documentation
And
stuff.
I like, just a personal style, is I like programming languages that help make me not make dumb mistakes. So I like languages and tools that help me be a better programmer, and that's just my own personal preference. And that's it. So we have classes and methods. So we can define methods as well. If I wanted to write something that sums two numbers, adds two numbers, you notice that we have our Pascal case here. That's not a compile time thing, it's not an enforcement thing, that's just a standard thing. If you would write like, oh, add two numbers, like this, it would still work. People would look at you weird, but that's not it.
Did they come over to you guys out of nowhere and look at you here?
Your pull request will probably get rejected.
Yeah.
But with this, our functions have a signature, and that tells us everything about the function. So this says, hey, this thing returns a number, a integer. It's called adds two numbers, and it takes two numbers itself. So now since I've defined that, I've kind of started to build my own rule structure. Is that var total equals adds two numbers. Yep. It's not in my IntelliSense, so I know I did something wrong. Adds two numbers,
Yeah.
and I add 100 and 330. So now I can only pass those things numbers because I defined that it only takes numbers.
Yeah. And also notice he's able to use the var because the compiler knows that add two numbers returns an int, so total's automatically an int. So not only is it like a hard-coded thing on the right-hand side, like var total equals 433,
Yep.
it can infer that this can only return a number, therefore this variable can only ever be an integer. So the compiler is super smart in that way. Okay, so if you tried to pass a string in there, like try and pass the string 100
Yep.
instead of the number 100.
So if I try to do that, in JavaScript and in Ruby, I think that would work.
Yeah, totally.
But here it's like,
The code would blow up, but you could
Yeah.
totally do it.
yeah, oh yeah, the code would do actually walk.
It would work in JavaScript, it would fail in Ruby.
Oh, okay,
Yeah, because JavaScript would promote the 100 to a number,
Yeah.
and then, but Ruby would blow up.
okay. But yeah, it wouldn't blow up until it actually ran.
Right.
This is saying that I won't even let you run because you're doing something weird.
Yeah.
100, and then classes. Just as kind of how everything else is going. Classes are a bit more verbose, a bit more explicit. We want to do a class person that has one property, right?
Yeah, like the name, yeah.
There's already a lot going on, but we're saying, hey, a person has one property that's a string called name. So even though in Ruby it was like the @name,
Mm-hmm.
it was kind of hidden, kind of inferred. We didn't quite know what name was. We could probably guess what name was because it was well typed. It was well named as a variable. But it's not like, well, what is name? Is name an object that contains a variable that has a first and a last? Or is it a string? This is way more explicit. I know exactly what I'm getting. If I wanted to say hello as a function on a person, say hello.
Or say hello.
It is hello. I'm this dot name. Yes, we have this. This is still a thing in C#. It's a bit more. I think it's more straightforward than it is in JavaScript.
Yeah.
Because JavaScript it gets funky.
Yeah. This is simpler in C#. And in Ruby we do have a this, but in Ruby it's called self. And it works very much the same way.
Yep. And our constructors.
Void.
Void means nothing. Void means that I'm not
We're
returning
not
anything.
returning.
It's just doing something. Our constructor person doesn't have any parameters. This dot name equals. So it's a bit more verbose, but also a bit more explicit.
Mhm.
And to me, that feels good.
Yeah. You have to do the verbose part so you get the checking. Right.
Yeah.
That's the you don't get anything for free, right? There's no free lunch. So you're paying the tax of having to be more explicit, but you're getting the benefit of the language and the tooling doing far more checking for you. Right. That's to me, right, the part of like the crotchety programmer shaking fist at cloud, right? Like, I don't have to type all this stuff, just let me do the code. I know what I'm doing, right? Because I have a lot of experience. Like, all the mistakes that it's protecting from, I don't make those mistakes anymore. Right, I've been programming long enough that I don't need the compiler to check these things for me because I just don't make those mistakes that often. Right, maybe like once every 3 or 4 months I make a type kind of mistake. So I don't need the compiler always checking that stuff, and I don't have to be explicit.
Yeah. And this is kind of the difference in philosophy that Gavin and I share, is that like Gavin's confident in himself to not make those mistakes. I know I'm a person and I'm gonna make mistakes. I'd rather something tell me that I'm gonna make those mistakes.
Yeah.
So you say we needed experience like you to apply that?
Nope.
Nope. It's just that you will probably also not make those mistakes. You've been programming in JavaScript for weeks now, and maybe you've made a few of those mistakes. You will make less of those mistakes the more you program. Ruby is no or more or less checking than you have with your JavaScript experience. If you're sitting at JavaScript and saying, gee, I wish it would hold my hand more, awesome, right? Like, if this appeals to your nature, cool, awesome, wonderful. That's why we have multiple programming languages. If you look at that and be like, that feels too restrictive, then maybe you're the kind of programmer who likes languages like JavaScript and Python and Ruby and Lisp and Scheme and all of the non-type checky languages.
And one thing that I like about C# is that yes, I have this kind of like pillar of restriction to fall on, but there's also a lot of patterns and ways for me to gain the flexibility that JavaScript and Ruby have as well.
Mhm.
There are kind of more intermediate ideas like generics and interfaces, and you can do all that kind of stuff. But we have to know what we're doing in order to get it.
Yeah.
So that was, what else? That's pretty much.
Yeah. You want to show them
It
some
feels
web?
very JavaScript. Yeah, do you want to
Yeah,
show Ruby on
some
Rails?
some web framework stuff.
I have a web framework running right now, actually.
Whoa,
Whoa!
that was wild.
Wow!
Yeah, you want to show them? Since you're already there, you want to show them some .NET?
Yeah. So
Wow.
Here, apparently when I already switched screens.
Yeah, when you switch screens, like it flashes quite a bit.
So this is a .NET application. It is a .NET Web API. It's actually called, the technology is called Web API, and this is an API that has a React as a front-end application. This is what we'll be driving towards. It's nothing too crazy. We have a client app folder that has a React application. Your source, your components, your app, that should all feel very familiar to you. But the controller side, the actual API, this is a basic C# controller that returns a JSON object that returns random web. So this is kind of the other side of what the APIs are that you all have been using and been producing. As you see, at its core, it's just a class with a couple of methods. And that's something that I really like and enjoy, is that everything is just a class. It's just an object that I have methods that are doing things on. You'll notice, let's see, what else is there to show? The complexities. There's a lot going on here, but really as developers, we really care about the methods that are down here. This is kind of where C# is way more explicit, is that we actually have access and we can configure our server kind of right up front. It forces us, what Gavin was saying, how in order to drive the car, you have to build a little bit of piece of it, is that we're actually into the startup.cs, we're into the server configuration almost from day one, and we're kind of really seeing how the server works and really kind of building up from there. So we are a little bit closer to the metal, we're not kind of abstracted away as you'll kind of see in Rails. All this stuff is still here, but it's more like hidden away in a folder somewhere. This is more like, hey, you're gonna know exactly how everything works. Which I like. And then I can go in and fine tune, I can go in and actually like make my car do what I want it to do, and actually be in complete control over it.
What does your React app do?
So my React has a couple pages, has a counter, and it also has a fetch data. Whoa.
Features.
And what does your API return?
My API is returning a weather forecast object that, and if you go, hey, well, what is a weather forecast object? Down here, it describes its structure explicitly. It's saying, hey, a weather forecast object is a JSON structure that has the properties of a date formatted, a temperature C, and a summary, and a temperature as Fahrenheit as well.
Oh, cool. Maybe I'll try and build the same thing, so we can see the comparison.
Yes. And it just returns 5 random weather forecasts, and that's it.
Gotcha. So it does a date and a temperature
Mhm.
and a summary.
Yes. And everything is hard coded up here. As
Okay. Cool. So it picks a random summary.
Yep.
Okay. Cool. Maybe I will try and program the same thing in a Ruby app, and we'll see if you can point your front end at
You, yeah.
me.
Okay.
Cool.
So that's pretty
There's
much,
something more you want to show?
I mean, that's pretty much the .NET app that we're going to be driving towards. Is to have a very simple .NET API in the back that only produces JSON that our React app will then consume. It's a very modern approach to building an application. I don't think this has a database inside it because it's very simple. But our database context, this is where we're going to be interacting with our database. And all that's going to be doing is running like selects and wheres, our maps and filters, on database lists.
Yeah, and you'll notice that in a .NET app, there are folders for various things, right? You know, Mark said the client app goes in the client app folder, and our controllers, which is a technology we're going to learn, goes in our controllers folder, and pages go in a pages folder. So you can see, kind of like when we went to React, our folders got a little busier with more things. Right, we started out with just like an index HTML and a CSS file. then we added JavaScript, then we added React. Now we have .NET. Like our folders just keep getting bigger. You'll see the same thing when I generate a Rails application, and we'll see what that looks like. Cool.
Yep. I think that's, at least that's it for right now.
Cool. Let me show the same thing. What that looks like
Yeah.
in a Rails application. So let's try and make the same thing that Mark was making. See how that works out. Let's get this out of the way. So we're going to make a new project. I'm assuming Mark ran a tool like this when he generated his C# program.
Yes. See how Gavin's running Rails new, that we have probably a few more parameters.
Yeah.
I ran .NET new React app.
Yeah. Well, I'll call mine React app.
That's pretty much what it is.
So Mark's tool did the same thing. It's going to create a folder for us, kind of like AppApp has been creating folders of files for us. Same kind of thing. If I go into here, I will see a similar structure, right? So Mark had a folder of files. We have a folder of files, and they kind of follow a similar stance. And if you look in app, we also have controllers, because both .NET and Rails follow a very similar, though slightly different
Yep.
philosophy, model, view, controller. And you'll hear this idea a lot, MVC or MVVC, or yours is, model, view, view model, controller, right?
We're model view, it's MVP.
Okay.
Nowadays, I think.
Gotcha. Okay.
There's like 3 or 4 acronyms that pretty much all mean the same thing
Mhm.
at a very high level.
Yeah.
Kind of how like functions and methods are pretty much the same thing except for minor details. All those MVC, MVVC, MVP, all those acronyms are pretty much the same high-level ideas, but minor details difference.
Yeah. Cool. So our Rails application is kind of the same thing. It's going to generate a lot of configuration for us out of the box. Some of the same ideas in terms of if you want to go in and change how your Rails application works, we have to kind of dig into some of these configuration files. But for the most part, as developers, we stay up here in this app folder. And Mark's program generated some things in his controller. This is a place where I think you were asking me about documentation. If we want to make a new controller, oh shoot, I know what I did. I should not have installed the newer version of Ruby before I started. Let me go back and
While he's doing that, most languages have their sort of command line tools centered around what feels good for development. So with JavaScript, we've been using AppApp, right? AppApp kind of does everything for us. There's also, we've been using Yarn to run our apps. Well, really, AppApp is just a shell around code generators. So there's something called Yeoman out there, and I don't know if it still is, but at one point, AppApp just said, hey yo, create for me this template, and it'll do that. Our AppApp for Gamma is a wrapper around what's called Create React App. Create React App is the React command line tool that says, hey, here's how we create a new React app. We just kind of put it in AppApp so it feels warm and fuzzy. It's true, we did. So Gavin is using the Ruby and the Ruby on Rails CLI to kind of work with tools and work with the language. We'll be using the .NET CLI to do pretty much the exact same commands, except instead of Rails something, it's going to be .NET something. Most modern languages have something like that. So what you do eventually go and learn your second language or whatever your first job is, really take the time to learn the command line tools. Because those are very consistent across all platforms, very consistent across all environments. And not every day will you have some sort of like GUI interface. You have to actually go in and use the terminal. So it's always good to kind of like start there and go, what are the command line tools for this given language? And then that's what we'll be doing on Monday, is actually exploring those command line tools in our respective languages. So need to start.
yeah, API database
Yeah,
is
I mean, I can tap dance.
Yeah.
I used to dance in high school, fun fact. I did.
Let's just generate a new
True
one.
story.
Wait, you're gonna do it now, right?
No, that's-
That's what you set us up for expectations.
No, I know. Right? Maybe by the end of the cohort, if you are lucky.
Maybe, then
Maybe.
no.
So I do a lot of ballet and jazz.
Yay.
Because I was in color guard and marching band, so I did that to kind of help train for that stuff. So I actually have a picture somewhere because people don't believe me half the time. It's like, you didn't do any of that stuff. It's like, yeah, I did. I was a huge nerd. Still am. But
Did you really juggle too?
oh yeah, yeah,
Excellent.
I still do. I picked that habit up in college as a good stress reliever, and it was just kind of stuck.
Oh, the juggling?
Yeah,
Yeah, I picked it up because pretty much everybody in the computer science department juggled.
yeah.
It was like a thing.
Yeah,
I juggled.
nice. Yeah, I broke my ankle in college, and it was during December, during the cold months up north, and so I couldn't go anywhere. So I was literally stuck in my room. So I made my first set of juggling balls by hand, and then I learned to juggle because I had nothing else to do. Then I needed to do
How
something.
many did you get up to?
I could do 4.
Oh,
Yeah.
After 3 is hard.
Yeah.
I think
Once
Once
you-
Three is hard, yeah.
No,
Once you
three,
learn-
3 is, but.
Once you learn 3, 5, and 7 are the exact same pattern,
Oh,
just
okay.
taller. And 4, 6, and 8 are the exact same patterns, just taller as well.
Oh, really?
So once you learn 3 and 4, you can, in theory, be able to do 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Yeah, just requires more dexterity
Yes.
Yeah.
and accuracy.
I always say juggling numbers more than 3 is just dropping things with style.
Yeah,
Because that's your hobby, is just dropping.
yeah. And then pins are a whole different thing,
I
and
love
then
pins. I
yeah,
have a set of pins in my car, I think.
yeah.
Yeah.
Pin, like
Bowling pin.
but they're
Oh, okay.
slightly different shape. Yeah.
So,
Interesting.
So one of the things, and I think .NET shares this philosophy too, is we write a lot of this code, and some of it is like we call it ceremony. Also, another term is boilerplate.
Yes.
We keep writing the same thing over and over. Most of these tools, and I think .NET has the same generators that will sort of create the shell of something for you. Did you ever install the React plugin, the RCC plugin for
Yes.
them?
Yep.
Yeah. So it's kind of like RCC, the thing that generates the React boilerplate of class something, extends React def render. So I created a new controller called Weathers Controller that's going to try and redo what Mark was doing. And if we come into my code now, we will see that my controllers folder now has some code in here that says there is a Weathers Controller index. Right? So index is going to be the method that's going to list weathers for us. Mark said that his code had a forecast model, right? So let's create a Ruby class called forecast. And Mark, what were the things that your forecast model had?
it had date formatted, temperature C,
ATTR stands for attribute, right?
Mm-hmm.
it had summary, and temperature F.
So in .NET, Mark had the name with the get and the set. In Ruby, the way we make this is with what we call an accessor. So this gives us the ability to write code like, and we can say forecast dot date equals date dot today, and forecast. I meant to type it this way. Right, summary is windy. Right, that's what the adder accessor does. It lets us have these attributes that we can get and set, just like C# has get and set. So I've now defined this, although I think your temperature F or your temperature C was a conversion from the other, correct?
Yeah, the temperature F was a conversion.
So if you don't want this to be an accessor, we can make it a method that takes the temperature C, I always forget this, we multiply it by,
So it's 32.
right,
32 plus, I then parenthesis temperature C divided by 0.05556.
Like this?
Yep.
Cool. Right. So here's our little forecast class like you had, and we want 5 of those.
Yep.
So here's an interesting thing in Ruby. You want something to happen 5 times. We can say 5 times do. So even numbers in Ruby have methods on them that let us do things. We can say 5, call the times method. It will do whatever we give it in this block that many times, right?
War games.
Yeah, and like even if you like read this out in English, 5 times do the following thing. Kind of tries to get as Englishy as we can. So let's say 5 times. We can also chain on a map, right? And what we end up getting is the index. Right, and we get hello 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we can also get the index. So we can say 5 times map. Let's take the index and let's make a forecast. And why can I type forecast today? Or initialize. Forecast.temperature. And let's make a random number. Let's see. You had some random number like between 32 and 100, something like this.
Negative 20 and 55.
Between 20 and 55. This is your temperature C.
Yep.
So this will give us a random number between 20 and 55. And your your summary was also randomly selected too, was it not?
Yeah, from a list of summaries.
So let's make a list of summaries. So here's another thing that I like about Ruby. We're going to make a list of summaries that are words. Normally in JavaScript you would do like sunny and rainy and snowing, right? Programmer happiness. Remember I said this makes a string? Well, if I put a W here, it makes an array of words. Sunny, rainy, snowing. Boom, array of words. So we often type arrays of strings, so we get a shorthand for it. Snowy, rainy, sunny, blizzard, Godzilla. Right, and if we now want to pick one of these randomly, another programmer happiness is I can say summary sample. And that just gives me a random sample from that array. No length, map, thing, floor, upper, blah, because we do this a lot too. So I can make that a sample from my summary. And forecast, I think we said date. So remember I said we have 5 dot times. We also have date dot today. Require date. We have date dot today. But what if I wanted date dot tomorrow or 5 days from now? This is where something like Rails says, hey, we often talk about an event that happens X days from now or some number of years from now. So Rails takes the number class where I couldn't previously do .5.days from now and goes into the number class and adds magic behavior to it, where now I can ask for 5.days from now, or I can ask for 5.days ago. Right? These features on the number didn't exist until the programmer who made Rails said, hey, numbers, you should have more powers, and reopen that number class. Many languages don't let you do this, right? Because what if 2 different people decided to crack open the number class and make how 5.days works? Right? 5.days. Right? So the way this works is it turns it into a number of seconds. But if another programmer comes along and redefines days, oh, bad things happen, right? So you can crack open classes and extend them, But if two people try and do the same thing, bad things can happen. So let's just make this index.days from now. And we should now get some number of forecasts. So we can assign this to a variable and then say, hey, we want these forecasts, but we want them as JSON. So if I run my server, so just like React, we have a localhost 3000. But this is just a, hey, Rails is working. If I want to know what URLs are in my app, I can type Rails routes, and it tells me all of the things it can do. Ignore these down here, they're for something else. But it says, hey, I have a weathers/index that I can go to, and I get just the date, because I want to say I want the date and the summary and the temperature C and the temperature F. What if I tell it what I want? I'm only getting the date. That's interesting. Forecast date, temperature. Am I getting increasing dates? Yeah, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. What if I make the date here? I'm only getting one thing. I'm getting the last value. Oh, because I have to return the forecast here. There we go. Right, so here's my date, my temperature, and my summary, and you see I have random summaries. If I need the temperature F, since that's computed, I have to tell it to add that.
So for Ruby, you don't have to still return from.
You do not, because in Ruby, the very last value of a method is the return value of the method. Right. So this is the very last value of this part of the do end, and I can leave out the word return. This pattern is so common with variable equals something new, return the thing. Ruby has a way to flip this on its end, and we can say tap do forecast, and that gets rid of this boilerplate, and we'll see. Right? So the tap automatically gives this forecast the new forecast and returns the value. Right? Another example, that tap didn't exist until like Ruby 2.4 because it came from Rails. So this is an example of us re-extending the language to get rid of kind of boilerplate code, right? And now we have some number of forecasts. I don't know if this is returned in the same format your API needs, right? But right, we could add more things here, right? So the same idea is going to happen when we get into hooking this up to data. There are shortcuts and I want to say shortcuts. There are structures that we follow for being able to pull data from databases that work one way in Rails and another way in .NET. But the interesting thing is we're both going to use the same idea of SQL databases. We're just going to have a layer of Ruby on top so we can express our database things in Ruby. And then we have a similar set of expressions in C# to be able to get data from Ruby. Because we're in a real like weather forecasting app, we're not going to randomly select data, right? We're going to put these forecasts for cities into a database and then be pulling them out of that database to show them to the user.
Yeah, we're both going to be using Postgres databases. We both have this layer called an ORM, which helps us work with databases better with our native languages.
That's
So
that's an ORM, O-R-M, which is
object
relational model.
Or mapping, or is it mapper?
We call it an object relation model.
Okay.
and you call it a mapping. Same idea.
But it's pretty much how can we have our native objects, so like a forecast model or a class, a person class, how can we use those things built into the language to work with SQL instead of having to work with SQL directly?
Because actually for the first couple of days next week, we're going to do class altogether because the database technology is the same regardless of what language you're putting on top of that database. So for our exploration to databases, we're going to be all together, and then we'll split into groups for, okay, now that we know how to use databases, how do we use them in Ruby? How do we use them in C#? How do we use them in .NET? How do we use them in Rails?
Yep.
But pretty much everything that you all do in .NET, we're going to have a very similar assignment. We're actually going to do the same assignments, just in different languages. You'll find that in the assignments, it'll say, hey, name your database this in Ruby because it follows the Ruby conventions. Name your database this in .NET because it follows the .NET conventions. Is that was a half-hand or question?
Yeah, no, sorry, it was a hand that turned into a cough. Basically, something like TAP, something like React hooks, something just like new concepts that are coming out. How do you guys, like, where do you guys, are you on the mailing list for Ruby? Like, I'm just.
Yeah. Well, yes. In fact,
Before we leave, like, we're gonna, at least personally, I would love to want to keep this bleeding edge as possible.
Yeah,
Or just
well,
at least
gathering types of stuff. I know at least for the .NET, there's a .NET blog and mailing list from the official team. There are a whole bunch of podcasts that are awesome. I'm subscribed to the .NET newsletter.
yeah,
This is-
I literally subscribe to Ruby Weekly,
Yeah.
and once a week I get a, hey, what's happening in Ruby this week?
Yeah.
Secret is 90% of this comes from Reddit, r/Ruby. So I read that. I follow the Ruby Lang website because a lot of the discussion goes on there. Right, new version of Ruby comes out. There's a vulnerability in Ruby Gems. Right, this kind of blog here. I come and check this.
Yeah.
And realistically, these things don't move so fast that you have to do that. Like, you don't have to be reading this every single week just to be able to, like, exist as a programmer. But every Christmas, we get a fairly decent major size release of Ruby. And when I say Christmas, I mean on Christmas Day.
Oh, wow.
Matt's every Christmas gives us a new version of Ruby and has done so for years.
So yeah, if you look like 2.6 was released on Christmas.
December 25th. Every Christmas we get a gift from Matt's, which is, and it's just like, that's a cute thing from the Ruby community. But we know that 2.6 is coming months in advance.
Yeah.
We get pre-releases. Most teams don't jump to 2.6 right away. The place that I worked on before I came to teach, like, they just got to Ruby 2.4 on their way to they did go to 2.5. They won't go to 2.6 probably until later this year. All right, so they're, okay, what's in 2.6? Cool, we'll move there when we need to move there.
Yeah. A new version of .NET is coming out. It's been being teased with release candidates and videos and talks since about October, and it's going to be fully released for production ready probably actually by the end of the cohort, maybe, hopefully. But like that 6-month cycle is very much like, hey, here's what's coming, here's what's coming on, and kind of it's a very slow burn. It's not like I need to know what's happening every like minor release.
Yeah, and you totally can do that.
Yeah.
More power to you,
Yeah.
but you don't have to.
I typically, so it looks like Ruby uses semantic versioning,
Kind of
ish,
Ish.
enough.
semantic-ish versioning.
Yeah. So like, I personally, so semantic version, I think you've all heard Jason's talk where the first number is a major version. That's API breaking changes. That's program language breaking changes. The next version is a minor patch, something relevant that enhances the language. And anything past that is a patch, like a minor, either a minor bug fix or minor something that doesn't really matter to me.
Yeah, could be a security fix.
Yeah. Some weird edge case with some weird library that's built in language that some people care really deeply about. That's too important. If it's a patch, I typically don't care about it. Minor releases, I do care because I'm curious if it's coming. So like, at least in .NET, it's 2.2 is the latest stable build. 2.3 is not coming. We're going straight to 3 because there's a whole bunch of new releases coming. Because that's kind of how I pay attention to stuff.
Yeah.
If those big numbers change, then I turn my head. If those small numbers change, I don't.
Yeah, I didn't follow 2.5.1, 2.5.2, 2.5.3. I did pay attention to 2.6
Yeah.
because 2.6 got some neat stuff in it. And usually by the time these things like flow down to the senior, mid, junior dev on the team has already decided like which new things are we going to use and which new things are we going to wait on using. But yeah, and sort of the nice thing. So I've been working in Rails since version 0.9, and at that time, like things changed every week, right? Like literally every week, like new things were happening, right? Because it's very early on in the development of some technology, and you see like even in React, right? We're not very far down the React pipeline, and we're throwing out set state and we're getting use state, right? That's a big shift that's going to happen, right? In the early curve adoption of technologies, things change really quickly, and then they plateau, right? So you'll hear like, Rails is dead and it's uninteresting and it's boring and what? Well, it's because it's become mature, right? We've gotten most of the major things we want out of it, and now we're at the level of kind of like maintenance. Like, hey, yeah, we're like adding things in that are important, but we're not world shifting every release. Like Rails 6 is coming, and the major thing we're getting is a editor box for web pages that has like what you see is what you get, like bold, italics, underline, drop images in, like a WYSIWYG editor. Cool, whatever. And we're getting the ability for our web apps to ingest inbound emails. Like we didn't have that before. You get to add a third-party package. And that's pretty much it. That's the major things in a very major version release of Rails. Like those kinds of things used to happen on like, hey, Rails 1.2.3 got these major things that broke everything. Rails is at that point where like we're maintaining, right? We're out writing apps, everything is cool, new versions are coming out, but we're not world shifting all the time. And what I think happens a lot in industry is that the thing that's getting a lot of attention is where that world shifting is happening, because that's where all of like the new hotness is happening and multiple teams are researching and new packages are coming out every week, and right, that's exciting. When the technology gets stable, right, it often gets this like, it's boring now moniker. And I think you're seeing quite a bit of that in the Ruby and the Rails community, because we've reached maturity of that framework.
It should be celebrated, right?
Yeah, I think that's great. Which means like, hey, I can go and be a Rails developer now and not have to worry about things changing all the time, which I did for years. Where like if you like went away for 6 months as a Rails developer in 2008, 9 and came back, you'd be like, what happened? Everything is different. Oh my goodness, right? Like we've completely changed how we're writing applications. No, that's great if you're like early adopter, right? Fast moving team. But as like you want to move into the more enterprisey world, you can't be changing that quickly. So that's great for us that we've reached that stability.
On the other side of the fence, in C# there's pretty much two big frameworks, .NET Framework and .NET Core. .NET Framework is the thing that's been around since 2000. We've hit that maturity, years ago. We've kind of been like a very nice, stable release. But .NET Core was released 2 years ago. That's when it was like public beta, alpha, like release candidate, early adopter kind of things. So for the past 2 years, it's been rapidly iterating and rapidly changing. So we're still in that kind of honeymoon phase of like what's possible, how to do things, what's the right way to do things, kind of figuring out what's going on. So it's kind of the best of both worlds, to be completely honest. And it's kind of why I like .NET Core, is that it's so new and fresh and rapidly changing and really just kind of.
Yeah. And then I think a lot of those new things also let you like shake off the dust of things that you did not like from whence it came.
Oh, yes.
Like, oh my goodness, all the things that like, I really don't like about the old thing.
Yep.
They fixed the new thing and it feels nice.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Other companies using Core, are they kind of moved over to Core?
And this goes down to the early adopters kind of idea, is that a lot of the early adopters, there was a startup called Presence. They adopted .NET Core as soon as it came out. They're like, hey, this is the cool thing, this is where .NET's going, let's do this now and be an early adopter. It's very successful for them, and that's awesome. There's another company called Performa. You'll be seeing them in a couple weeks. They're a bit more of an enterprisey, a bit more established. They're more like, hey, this is what works and this is what we're going to do. Their main product is in .NET Framework, but their newer research projects, R&D projects, newer features are in .NET Core. So we're slowly, as an industry, moving towards .NET Core, but the .NET framework's not going away anytime soon.
I think that's another, if you're looking at now, if you like want to talk about the
Yeah.
non-techie part of this, which we can do now or we can get back at 3.
Q&A or whatever.
I think the big difference is languages like Node and Python and Ruby, they kind of start in the open source world, so they kind of are very much the small startup-y attractive things, and are now starting to find more presence in, or sorry, I should say acceptance, because I don't want to use the word presence because they're a company. Acceptance in the enterprisey world, but that world is dominated by Java and C#. Right? If you're going into like a Fortune 1000 style company, pretty much chance it's going to be Java and C# and C, those languages. Right? That's like huge shift that direction. If you're looking at like the Silicon Valley startup or even like the Tampa Bay area startup, they're going to see more JavaScript, Ruby, Python, those things. You're still going to see C#, but the tilt is going to be kind of the other way. Because what these languages are optimized for is developer speed, right? I mean, that's like Ruby is for happiness, Rails is for productivity, right? Their key point is developer productivity. Every choice they make is, does this make the developers able to release code faster? Type less code, worry about code less, implement features faster. That's their goal. So as a new startup, like, wow, that sounds great. Like, we can get to market really fast, and the technology will carry us all the way through our 14th year in business, like my last company is, still as a Rails application, still maintained from version Rails 0.9 to Rails 5, right? That app has not changed. Like, that can happen, but they want to optimize for developer productivity. That's where you're going to see those things. So when it comes to like what kind of companies do you want to work for, that's also another thought in terms of which languages do they tend to gravitate towards. That's usually the big questions that students have is like, okay, so I want a job, which language should I choose?
And no startups use C#.
No, and look at Presence is C#.
Use C#, others.
What's the one that we do open code?
Calio.
Calio, aren't they
I
also
believe they're also
C#?
No startup.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So they do, some do.
Oh yeah.
I mean, Stack Overflow is on C#.
Yep.
So like, it's everywhere.
Yep.
It comes down to what is the culture inside the company, like where it came from.
Yeah. It can also come down to like when they were a 3-person startup, the CTO, meaning the guy who does all the coding or the gal who does all the coding, knew C#, so that's what they did.
So that's what happened at Presence. Their original CTO was a C# developer, and he built it in C#.
Yeah. Yeah.
At Presence, yeah.
Yeah. But now flip on the other side, look at something like this website, right? This was a startup, right? This is GitHub, right? Started out as a startup, but now you would probably consider them a pretty enterprisey app. This whole thing, all of the front end is still a Rails application and has been since the start. So you do see Rails in the enterprise, typically because they started out as a startup and became an enterprise. But you will also see a lot of Rails inside of enterprises for internal apps, which is kind of interesting. Right? Small internal dev teams create lots of Rails applications that consumers never see, but the internal organization uses because they want a lot of these apps out for their employees very quickly. That's where a language like Rails shines. So a lot of internal apps inside of enterprises may also be in something like Python, JavaScript, or Ruby. Who's if you're open to it, who's kind of locked in? I don't want to ask who's kind of like, you've already made your decision and you're good. Cool. Who has like no idea? Everybody else is kind of somewhere in the middle trying to figure it out, right? Cool.
So
Is there like a difference between like industries when it comes to Ruby and C#? Or?
Yeah, I think so.
yeah,
You mean in terms of like what kinds of companies use it?
Yeah.
Probably, yeah. A lot of big businessy people use C#. Maybe Raymond James.
Yeah, if you look locally, like if you name some companies like big companies in Tampa, like Raymond James, Tech Data,
Yep.
Tropicana,
Chase has a branch here.
Yeah.
Uses it.
A lot of Experian, she kept mentioning Ruby.
they are a Ruby shop.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they started out as a smaller company that got bought by a big company,
Okay.
right? So they started as a kind of a startup-y in that world, and they're a Ruby and Rails shop. But they also internally have Java. They started a conversion to Elixir, right? So they're branching out from there as well. I generally think it's typically more on like the kind of where the company got started. So if it is a established kind of enterprise company, you're likely to see more C#, Java. If it is a company that grew from a smaller company, more likely to see something like Ruby there than you will not.
And of course, those aren't hard and fast rules.
Yeah.
Those are just kind of overgeneralization.
Yeah, it's the pattern that you see.
So if you see a company that's hiring for, I mean, it's a question, but if you see a company that's hiring for .NET, but you have experience in Ruby, would it behoove you to apply anyway?
So, yes, but it comes down to how much is that company willing to accept a entry-level developer that has experience in languages that they don't have. I've seen it go both ways, where we have students that came here, learned Ruby or .NET or React or just learned one language, and then went off and got a completely different job. And that's because the job that they went to had a culture where it's like, okay, you know programming, we'll teach you the syntax of whatever languages, and that's fine. That being said, we also have alumni that are like, oh, I'm a Ruby developer, I applied for a C# job, and they're like, well, you don't know C#, so sorry.
Yeah, and the same thing, right? You're a C# developer and you apply for a Ruby job. Like, sorry, you don't know Ruby.
Yeah.
We need somebody who can do Ruby.
Mhm.
Right.
So,
So-
it's very company specific.
Yeah, and that's why I said like, you kind of have to think about. So there's like the problem with choosing, and we used to make students choose like before they even started, right? Because it was like you jumped in and we did like a week of HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and then you go like right into .NET front end or Ruby, right? Here you've had some experience like behind you, kind of figure out like how you learn and what you like and what you don't like, which I think for some people makes the choice easier, and for some people makes the choice way harder. The thing that I tell students is, if you come through, right, we're now gonna do 3 weeks of intense like back-end language, then you're gonna build a big project that's a full stack project, but using your back-end language choice. Then you're gonna do a demo day, and you're gonna start applying for jobs. So if you're like, boy, I know the types of company I'm gonna work for, and they're typically Java, C# companies, boom, C#, do it. Like if that's where you know your heart is. If you're like, man, I know there are some companies in town and they do Ruby and Rails and that's where I really want to be and that's my target, then do that. If neither of those things happen, then you have to think about which of these languages seem like the one where I'm going to learn programming the most over the next 3 years. Not I'm going to learn C# the most, or I'm going to learn Ruby the most, which is going to get me more programmer skills over the next 3 months, right? Which means like I'm going to be able to practice more and I'm going to feel more efficient over 3 months, over the next 3 weeks, right? And then the next thing to layer in is you graduate and you start applying for jobs, right? Yes, you can apply for C# jobs, but you have 6 weeks experiences with C#. If you see a job and it's like, wow, it's in Golang, right? There's a junior Golang position at XYZ company in Tampa. Should you apply for it? Yeah. Yes. If it's like yes, we take junior programmers, apply. Now, could you prep yourself by spending 6 weeks learning Golang and redoing all of your C# assignments in Golang? Absolutely. Right? Would you be just as prepared? Probably. So the reason I say that is because I think students often think like, well, if I choose Ruby, I can only ever do Ruby jobs, and if I choose .NET, I can only ever do .NET jobs. What it means is that's where your leg up is. So if you choose an environment where you don't have that leg up and you find one, you have to build that leg up to get some experience and say, yes, hey, here's my cover letter, XYZ company who's hiring Golang. I did not study Golang at Suncoast Developers Guild. I took Ruby or C#. But since I graduated, I've rebuilt all these projects in Golang, and this is the level that I've taught myself to. Please hire me so I can continue to learn with you. Right? That's the approach you kind of have to take for those. So I mention that because the market here is different for Ruby developers and C# developers. There is a bigger pool of C# jobs, but there's also a bigger pool of candidates. There is a smaller pool of Ruby and Rails jobs, but there's also a much smaller pool of candidates, specifically junior candidates. Right? Being a smaller pool means their hiring phases are different, right? So sometimes people are hiring right away when there's student graduation. Sometimes there's not, right? Sometimes there's a company we don't even know. Like we had people come to the last demo day who were Rails as a Rails shop, a company that makes, it's kind of like the Uber but for limousines. Didn't even know they existed. Like they came, they're like, yeah, blah, we're in town, right? Developers, cool. Haven't seen them again, but they're out there. Right?
This happens to us how often? Gavin and I have been running Canada for
13 years.
Coming on 14 years now.
Yeah.
And all the time, like we find out there's a company who's been around for years and we've never met anyone from the company and they're local.
Yeah.
Doing good.
It just means you've got to do a little bit more footwork to find them. So that also comes down to like what kind of job search are you looking to do? What are your requirements? How do you want to do your search? Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's, yeah.
Those are the number one things that I always hear students talk about when they're trying to decide between the two.
Yep. Do you have a job in mind? Do you have a field in mind? Do you have an environment in mind? Do you have a learning purpose? That's the two big questions.
Yeah. That for the people who are like in the middle, undecided, does that help? Hurt? Other questions?
Well, I mean, what is like one more?
Choose for us?
Yeah, right. Is there one language that would say would be more difficult to learn than the other? I mean, in terms of like Ruby versus C#, getting out of this. I mean.
Like if I learn C#, then learning Ruby versus learning Ruby, then learning C#, is one direction easier?
Right. It's like, oh, I do Ruby and then I get out and I find, okay, well, there's more .NET jobs that I could get. So.
No, I don't think there's a difference one direction or the other. I think it comes down to the person and the type of learner that you are. And the way that you have developed code taste so far.
Right.
Have you all played the Hourglass taste video? Yeah, I mean, you all have developed now a taste in the style.
Slack at some point.
And I know, like, I haven't been watching your homeworks over the last couple of weeks, but the thing that happens for me is I can, out of a group of 13 of you, right, if I've been reading your homeworks over the last weeks, I can read your code and tell you which person wrote it, because you all have a particular style that you program in, and a particular approach and sense of taste. You all are trying to figure out like what kind of developer you are, what kinds of things you appreciate and you like, and how you work. I think in that case, look at the one that matches your natural style best, because this opportunity, you have another 6 weeks with us, right? Having this 6-week opportunity doesn't happen very often, right? The best thing we can hope for you is that you landed a company that has such a strong mentorship program that it feels like this is still happening, right? That's what we want. That's what we're trying to build. That's what we want every company to behave like with juniors. So in that sense, I think you should choose whichever one you think out of what you saw today, like, oh, like, the way .NET kind of keeps me in my lane and warns me of things and whatnot. That feels good to me. I like that. Or like, hey, the freedom and expressiveness of Ruby and some of the automatic things that Rails does for us. that feels really good to me. That will get you further down your ability path while you're here, so that then jumping to the next language will be easier. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It though means that like that becomes your task in week 13.
Right.
Right? So that's why I say it's this hard balance between like, hey, there's a student I won't name from the past who's like, I need a job on graduation day +1. I'm like, cool, you should do .NET. Like, if you're telling me like you need a job the week after you graduate, .NET. Decision is done. Because there are many .NET jobs you could apply for the day after you graduate, and like, they're there. I will tell you though, typically in the past, we've seen Ruby students place faster than .NET students. Does that trend continue? I don't know.
Are they placed into Ruby jobs? No.
Yeah, not always.
Sometimes, no. Sometimes.
Sometimes yes.
I'd say more of the Ruby students end up doing something else
Yes.
than .NET students.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
For the same
That's-
reasons we described.
Yeah, that's also a pretty
There's
good pattern.
fewer Ruby jobs out there, but it goes to the point that like these skills translate because you're going to be learning your second programming language now.
Mhm.
As you go to learn your third and your fourth, it gets easier and easier and easier to where like you don't need a book or anything. You just like skim over a few README documents for a language you've never seen before, and you're productive already, right? Because like you've seen these patterns, and you're just like, oh, how do I do a switch in this language? Oh, it's called a case. Okay, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, it doesn't have classes. Oh, it has classes. Does it have like multiple inheritance? No, it doesn't. Okay, right? But you know what you're looking for,
Mhm.
and you just like, how do I do X in language Y? And you'll get to that point through repetition, but like you're going to be getting there already when you finish with Ruby or .NET. If there's a junior Go job, like yes, you'll be able to skill up and Go quickly.
Mhm.
And I can almost say specifically with Go, any company that's progressive enough to be using Go right now is probably the kind of company who's going to be hiring the person, not their resume.
Yeah.
And that's really key as well. So if you go in there and you show them the right things, they don't care if you've studied Ruby
Yeah.
or .NET here.
That's the other thing we try and tell employers, right? If employers come on campus, right, and they meet graduates, y'all have 6 weeks of this language. You are not experts at this language, right? The difference between like I have never started that language and I've worked in that language for 6 weeks is small enough that they could hire you, right? And your onboarding process would be like, let's repeat that, but for language Y, right? As part of your ramp up introduction. The companies that are progressive and junior friendly should be doing that anyway, right? So that's why I say like it's not a like, oh, I've made the decision and I'm locked in forever kind of decision, but there are reasons to choose between them.
And I don't think you can choose wrong here. I think if you ultimately put it to a coin flip, you wouldn't be making the wrong choice.
We've actually had a student in the past, I don't recommend doing this, they actually did a coin flip the day of.
Yeah.
We had another student using Magic 8 Ball.
And while,
Wow.
I mean, you would really only do this if you've asked yourself and thought about all
Yes.
the things we've discussed and still couldn't make up your
Yeah.
mind.
Yeah.
That's where I would definitely say, then you're not going to make a wrong choice going either way.
Yeah, those students really thought about it, talked to us, talked to each other, talked to alumni, and really asked them questions with
Mhm.
their due diligence. And it was like a last minute thing. It's like, well, which one are you doing?
Yeah.
And like,
Yeah, I think that's another great point is like ask past alumni about their choice. How did they make their choice? What did they consider?
yeah,
How do they feel about it afterwards? What are they doing now versus what they did then, right? Find alumni who are doing something different than what they studied here, see what their process was. I think all of those things can help you if you haven't made up your mind.
6 1, half dozen the other.
yeah.
Yeah, you get that answer.
You said something about some people that graduates from here, say they went for Ruby, end up doing something else. What?
.NET, Java, Groovy, Python.
React, pure
End
front
up
end
just
React.
doing pure front end.
Yeah, it's,
Okay.
It's anything.
And the same thing on the .NET side. You've had students who are not doing .NET now they've gone on to do other
They
things.
went on to do other things, whether it's Ruby, React, Vue, something else.
Yeah.
The first time around, it's kind of like how you sell yourself
And yeah,
and how you.
I think Jason said it is a lot of junior positions, like, they know you've been only been coding really for 12 weeks. They don't expect you to be experts or the next, like Steve Walker at this thing, They're pretty much hiring you as a entry-level developer that wants to learn, that wants to improve, that wants to do well.
Yeah.
So as long as you communicate that to them somehow in the interview, like Gavin said, oh, I spent the last 6 weeks upskilling myself on Go, even though I didn't go to school for Go. Like, to me, as a senior developer, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Like, that's amazing.
What's really interesting is we had a student who was a Rails student. This was back at Iron Yard when it was solely was this V2? I'm trying to think is for it's now at Haneke. I don't want to say the name.
Oh, him.
Yeah. Was that V2 or pre V2?
I think if it's what I'm thinking of, it's V2.
It was V2. It was definitely
The
V2.
third person to go to Haneke?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like this person was searching. This person was searching for a Rails job. It was because it was our very last. It was our very last cohort. Yeah.
Okay.
So he was off looking for a Rails job. Didn't find anything. Was like, I don't know what I'm gonna do. Taught himself Objective-C and iOS programming, and then taught himself something else, and taught himself something else. And then just before he was going to take a job in something else, I don't remember what it was, one of the people who we had interviewed for Rails job called him back and eventually did hire him, and he's back to doing Rails.
Like
but his
6
journey,
months later.
6 months later, but his journey took him through learning other things.
Yeah.
6 months.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
He was being very picky.
Yeah.
He was being very
He
picky.
was on his own life journey.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. He was not a I need a job the day after I graduate
Yeah, I got
person.
homeless by then.
Yeah.
Right.
6 months.
Yeah. He wasn't job like graduation
Yeah.
plus one. That's
Yeah.
not what
He also did contracting work for a while during that
Did
time.
other things.
Yeah, well, programming contracting work.
He helped me take down cubicles in here.
Yeah.
Making
Yeah.
it easy.
Yeah.
Or ish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, he helped build some of these desks.
Oh,
Mhm.
oh, nice.
Yeah.
Since we're not naming names,
Yeah.
we'll just tell you his life story.
All right. And his initials are.
Others made it.
Yeah. His name rhymes with.
Wait.
You're also welcome to come talk to us individually if you have questions.
So you mentioned that after seeing somebody's code for a while, you're familiar with their style,
Mhm.
and those styles could lend themselves to one or another. So not in a purely choose for me way, but Mark, would you be willing to, if somebody were to ask, would you have a suggestion?
If
Would you
someone-
form a suggestion?
You can magic people.
For the first, so if someone will come to me with that question, for at least the first half hour, I'm not going to give you a straight answer.
Yeah.
I'm only going to ask you questions and kind of pry into and kind of not lead you one way or the other, but just kind of see what you feel. It'll be a lot like, oh, how did you like React? What did you like about JavaScript? What do you like about programming? Did you like this cottage? Did you like that cottage? Did you like this idea? Did you like that idea?
Yeah. And then also ask I would ask you things that you did not like. Like what do you find frustrating about programming so far? Like what makes you want to throw your computer off the table? Right.
If you multiply the number 4, or you add the number 4 to the string 4 in JavaScript, and you get the string 44 rather than the number 16,
Yeah.
do you find that a convenience or a pain in the ass? Right?
I love that. That's so awesome.
That is fun to me.
Right, because it doesn't work this way.
Yeah.
Five times Gavin doesn't work, but Gavin times 5 does, because the multiplier method on Gavin means repeat.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because it's actually
What you're essentially calling is a method called star on a string, which means repeat, but on a not call, it's
send.
call is JavaScript.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
But the multiply method on a number means multiply by the second argument, and the second argument in this case is a string. You can't multiply a number
Right.
by a string.
Well, gee, I wish repeat would work. Let's make it work. Let's reopen the string class and define the repeat
Just
method.
alias at this time, right?
Yeah, but I'm going to write it out.
Sure.
Now, I can. I just changed the language.
Yeah.
Oh, yes! The power! The power is all mine! Right?
And some people see this and they're like, oh,
They just run away.
that's so dangerous.
Because what if you're collaborating and you know,
Yes,
like,
exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. What if you're
a
using
monster.
what if you're using some third-party library that's gone and changed all these
Right.
core features of Ruby, and then now your code starts behaving differently
Right.
because of that?
So you don't
That's-
have the power. It's like that. Oh, that's
But you do.
Temporarily.
You
It's
have
a
that
fight.
power as well. It is. And for some people, that's great. And for other people, that's new. That's a non-starter.
Yeah, because it can never end. Does it ever end? Is there like a port? Like, how do you stop that?
Yeah.
No.
So in the Ruby community, we've come up with like
body's shaking.
times that you do that and times that you don't. And most of the time you don't.
Right.
Right?
So it's just like understood.
Oh! I changed what plus means in my language. 5 plus 3 is 0. Don't do this. Please don't do this.
But the fact that you can.
But the fact that I
is a really
can.
cool thing about Ruby.
Yes.
The fact that you can't do this in other languages, intentionally or unintentionally, can be a good thing.
Yes.
But depending on the problem you're trying to solve, sometimes you need or want something like this in order to be really expressive in the way you solve the problem. Other times, no, this is the worst idea ever. And it all depends. And sometimes it depends on the way you solve problems. And like I said, sometimes the problem itself can lead to whether or not this is a good idea.
Yeah, so you can do this kind of stuff in C#, but it takes a lot more effort, and you can't ever replace functionality. You can only extend or add to functionality. So yes, you can change stuff. No, you can't actually go back and make 5 plus 3 equals 0. That's bonkers.
There's a proposal, right? Ruby has split like JavaScript has split, but there's currently a discussion about whether the divide between two strings should be a split, right? Should I be able to say this is a sentence divided by a space would be the same as a split, right? But like the Ruby programmer could be like, cool, that sounds reasonable. In my projects, that's what dividing two strings means. Just in the projects that I create, I have the ability to do that. I don't have to wait for the gods of programming to decide to allow me to do that. I find that cool.
Yep. In JavaScript, they'd probably just try to turn both of those things into numbers and
Yeah.
then do the division.
Because, JavaScript.
Yep.
NaN.
NaN.
Yeah, which
It's
zero
not
divided
wrong.
by 0 is NaN.
Yeah.
It's not wrong.
Change it to like 4. Yeah.
4, this is a sentence. This is to a sentence divided by 2. Oh, we still got NaN.
But I think it's because it doesn't do what Ruby does, where it like looks at the first digit and stops.
Oh,
So change that to just like 4 divided by 2.
nope, still.
Yeah. So just try 4 and 2 as strings.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So Ruby would look at this and be like, okay, string, and as soon as it sees something that's not a number, it's like, okay, that's a number now. That's the number 4. Everything else after that, I'm gonna ignore. JavaScript's like, nope, that's not a number.
And C# would just go, nope.
Yeah, C# would just throw an error at you.
Sorry, you can't do that.
JavaScript errs on the side of not having errors. That's why it does some of the weird things it does, is it tries to just keep the code moving. Yeah.
Now it does.
Yeah.
Right? But like some teams and some programs look at this like,
Yeah.
no, go away. This is terrible. Right? But like this level of flexibility is why something like Rails exists. The Rails framework in its approach would not work in a language that does not let us do this because of the philosophy that DHH, David Heinemeier Hansson, has about how web frameworks should work, could only do this in a language that lets us crack the heart of Ruby open and change it.
That's why people say like Ruby is so expressive and you can write code that almost looks like English. It's because you can abuse what that code is, right? And then make it feel more like English.
Remember this adder accessor that's sitting here? That looks like keywords in the language. They're not. This is really a method called on self. It's really this. But the rule in Ruby is we don't need parentheses to call our functions, right? Just like this is a sentence dot split. Like this, right? These parentheses aren't needed because Ruby lets us leave parentheses out. So this looks like, this feels like code. Temperature, right? That looks more like the language, and Ruby's expressiveness lets us do that.
And in a Rails model, instead of add or accessory, you'd say like has many.
Right.
Right? Like an author has many posts.
So I've watched this movie. I just mentioned it earlier. War Games, and it kind of this Ruby Rail really reminds me of that movie. And then another guy told me that Ruby Rail is like the flower child of what programming, but it has the potential to be dangerous.
It looks
Is that
like
what? Yeah.
So since Ruby doesn't check you and keep you in your lane, you have the ability to go further down your programming before you realize you've made an error. I think one thing that we talked about early on was like, check your code more often.
Yeah.
Because you would write huge blocks of code. I remember when we were first doing JavaScript, you would write huge blocks of JavaScript, and then you would run it, and you'd be like, nothing works, right? So Ruby's gonna let you write as much as you want. Until you run it, you won't know if it's working or not. Where .NET is checking along the way. What you gain from the limitations of how flexible C# is as a language lets them do that. If Ruby started to do that, some of the expressiveness and magic would go away. So Ruby chooses to give you very sharp tools that you can cut yourself with, right? And it's up to you to like stay in the lane, right? Which is why early on we don't show you all of the magic in Ruby. Like we keep the magic behind the curtain until you're ready to know it, right? Like you're learning to be a chef. They don't give you the super sharpest knives, right? They can like slice your finger off without knowing, right? They give you good knives, but not the most dangerous knives. Same thing here. So when he says, right, it's more dangerous, what it means is it's going to give you more ability to generate more code that could have problems in it that you don't know.
It'll allow you to do something stupid, but also allow you to do clever.
Yeah, and there's nothing that tells you while you're writing code, are you doing something super powerful and responsible, or something super powerful and very, very wrong, right? Which is why the Ruby community and the Rails community has a very strong culture of testing, right? Because with a very powerful, flexible language, you need good tests to tell you whether the code you're writing works. Right, like when we were starting JavaScript, like, hey, let's add an event handler that has an onClick, that has a console log that tells me that I clicked before I start write the code inside of it. The Ruby community says, yes, but you should also have a test that tells your manager that that code works, that they can see your test report and say, yes, these automated tests make me know that my code works. But that also means you then have to also write test code, because that's how your code is validated. We don't even have the type checking, syntax checking that C# has. We have to be more conscious of how much we have to write tests for our code. So that's when he says more dangerous, right? And like the flower children is more like, you know, like how I redefine the slash, the divided to turn split, right? Or I change 5 + 3 to mean 0. Right, like we have all the power, we can do whatever we like, right? Freedom, but also danger. Cool.
That's fun.
Yeah.
It's always fun to see the different languages and the different philosophies.
Yeah. And you know, you move on to a language like Elixir, it has other cool things that Ruby and C# doesn't have. I love, but I would never write code in a language called Haskell. and I love it because it's a very mathematical language. Writing code in Haskell is like writing proofs in mathematics. They're very similar, with the same level of like notation and rigor. But the code is like amazing, but the amount of rigor you have to have for that is way too high to ever write like production code in it. I can't imagine. But it's super fun. But I'm not ever gonna write professional code in it.
Super awesome, super amazing. It's like everything is off the charts. I just don't want to write it.
Yeah, I love writing it for CodeKatas. I'm not going to do it to write my next web app in it.
No.
Right, but I appreciate it for what it is, right?
Yes.
Every language has its pros and cons and warts and lovely things. Cool.